Fall for many folks across the United States is their favorite time of the year, but sometimes frost and freezes can really have a damper on your fall plans. I'm meteorologist Stephen Abshire here with 5 News, and I'm going to be breaking down what brings frost and freezes and the timing of it, and also the outlook as we get going through the rest of fall. But when it comes to what causes frost formation, frost is simply just ice crystals that are forming on surfaces outside on those cool nights into the morning hours. It can do on things like your car or on your outdoor furniture, but commonly you see it on your grass outside. And frost can form at a wide range of temperatures. The thermometer actually doesn't have to be below freezing to see frost, but it becomes a little bit more widespread when you have the temperatures below 32 degrees. And frost is actually a little bit more prevalent when you have some clear nights with some calm winds. You're more likely to see frost be a little bit widespread, but the reason for that is just due to the nature of the atmosphere. As you get onto those colder nights, you tend to have what's called a temperature inversion. But normally in the atmosphere, the temperature decreases with height. That's why it's colder on the top of Mount Everest than when you're just walking around outside in your day-to-day life. But when it's cold and calm in the evening hours of the fall, sometimes you get something called a temperature inversion, which means the temperature is actually decreasing as you get closer to the ground because that warm air is rising and that cold air is sinking. And when that happens, that means where the thermometer is maybe a couple of feet above the ground normally if you're reading it at your home or if you're on your phone, where the temperature is normally read a couple feet off the ground or 2 meters off the ground, it could say it's 34 or 35 or 36 degrees, but lower towards the ground, it's actually only 30 degrees. So the air right there is able to freeze, and that's when you see frost, even if it's not below freezing outside. But generally, when it is below freezing, you see a little bit more widespread frost. But across the United States, there's generally a big range of when you could see frost in the fall, and that really differs in the elevation towards the how high up in the air you are. If you're near the Rockies or in the Ozarks or the Appalachians, you're more likely to see frost a little bit earlier in the year. And also, if you're farther north and those cooler nights and that cold air begins to sink in, you're more likely to see frost a little bit earlier in the year. But some areas of the Rockies have their first frost in August, which is a little bit unusual for most of us in the United States who normally see frost sometime in October. But the farther south you go, that's when you start to see frost into October. For much of the central United States, October from the 1st to the 31st is when you see a lot of those first frosts. As the farther south you get, you might have some frost getting into November or even December. In some areas of southern Florida and southern Texas don't see frost at all, or it's very rare to see it, and they don't see it every single year. But generally, frost is happening in the second half of October going into November across the United States. But when it comes to what to expect for your watches, warnings, and advisories when it comes to frost, they generally only happen during the growing season, which is the average time between the first frost in the fall and the first frost in the spring. So in between that span over the summer is when you would consider the growing season. But when you do have the chance to see either frost or freezes over that time period, the National Weather Service might issue an advisory, watch, or warning. But when it comes to which one's going to be issued, a frost advisory simply means that there's a chance of frost sometime during the growing season. So like I mentioned earlier, you could have temperatures above 32 degrees, like between 33 and 36 degrees, where frost could happen in some of the rural or cooler areas, which might have some damaging impacts on some vegetation or anything, livestock outside. But when it comes to a freeze watch, that means freezing temperatures below 32 degrees are likely sometime between the next 24 and 36 hours. And when it comes to a freeze warning, that means those temperatures are expected. It's much more prevalent the later on you get into the fall, but once you get too late into the fall towards the winter, these watches and warnings will no longer be implemented because it's outside of the growing season. But here in Arkansas, when do we normally see that first 32-degree day when we see our first freeze? It kind of ranges depending on where you are in the state. If the farther north you are, the more likely you are to see it earlier into October, mainly because of the elevation as you get into the Ozarks and the Ouachitas. That's when you have higher elevation, like I mentioned earlier, can cause those frosts to be a little bit earlier in the year. But the farther south you go, you can also expect it to be closer into November. But one area which is a little bit surprising is that circle around Little Rock. But normally sees their first 32-degree day sometime in the middle to late November. And the reason because of that is because it's a large urban area. It's generally warmer because of emissions and because of something called the urban heat island effect, which traps in heat in urban areas because of all the concrete that is warmer than, let's say, you're in rural parts of Washington and Benton County where things are luscious and green. Well, by the time they're in the fall, they might be brown. But those plant life is really lets that heat go a little bit easier than when you'd expect if you're in an urban environment. But taking a look at the United States, what can you expect as we get later on into this fall, maybe through the rest of October, in terms of when you can see our first frosts and freezes? Well, we have some big change coming up in the end of October. Much cooler weather is expected for the eastern half of the United States for the next 10 days. And for the western half of the United States, much warmer conditions are expected. So a lot of the eastern United States, including Arkansas, is expected to see some frosts and freezes over the next week into the next 10 days as we get going. Then parts of the West Coast might have to wait a little bit longer before they see some of those frosts. But in general, beginning of October through the middle of November is when a lot of the United States, especially the eastern United States, begins to see those first frosts and freezes. This has been Stephen Abshire with your 5 News Frost Update.